Hello, welcome to VLGA Connect for another week, brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. I'm Chris Eddy, good to have you with us. On the program today, I talked to the Victorian Information Commissioner, Morrison, about the risks and pitfalls of using generative AI from a privacy principles perspective predominantly. Lots of P's there. It's a conversation of relevance for every councillor in particular. There are new ministerial guidelines in place for councils in Victoria on how they must deal with ratepayers experiencing hardship, and Tony Raunic is joining us to unpack those guidelines, plus a selection of news stories from the past week. That's coming now in Connect News. Greater Bendigo councillor Owen Cosgriff has been found guilty of misconduct for slamming his fist on a table, storming out of a meeting and making disrespectful comments about staff, all largely stemming from tensions over the Bendigo Writers' Festival. He's been ordered to publicly apologise at the 16th of March council meeting, with the arbiter finding the misconduct to be at the lower end of severity. Councillor Cosgriff has defended his actions as legitimate political debate, and he's expressed concern about the potential chilling effect of the report on robust discussion. The Borough of Queenscliff Council has announced Jane Grover as its new executive officer, chief executive, I should say. Ms. Grover's extensive leadership experience in the public and private sectors includes her previous role as CEO of the Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust. She starts on the 16th of March. Wellington Shire Council has a motion before it for its meeting next week, calling on the Victorian State Government to require offshore wind farms to contribute to local communities through a payment in lieu of rates framework, similar to onshore renewable energy projects. The council argues this would ensure fair contributions from all electricity generators and provide essential funding for infrastructure and services in coastal communities affected by offshore wind developments. If supported, that motion would go through to the MAV State Council. A glitch that caused the wrong rates bill to be sent to 140 ratepayers in Mornington Peninsula Shire was caused by a new automated computer system. The Mornington Peninsula Leader reported this week that the error also affected 4 other councils that also moved to the new system. A decision on the flying of the Palestinian flag at the Preston City Hall has again been deferred by Darebin City Council. At a special meeting earlier this week, the council resolved to receive a briefing on the outcomes of a recently conducted 3-week community consultation process. The council will then determine the issue of the Palestinian flag as part of its adoption of a new flag policy, with that consideration to occur no later than the end of March. An urgent appeal by Brimbank City Council for more police has received plenty of media attention this week. The Herald Sun and 9 News were among the outlets reporting that Brimbank lost 25 officers last year, the worst decline of any Victorian council area. The council wrote to the Police Minister in October about the issue, but says it's yet to receive a response. Speaking of media appearances, Ballarat councillor and former 3-time Mayor Des Hudson made the final stage of Channel 9's Tipping Point program this week. He came away with a tidy sum of $6,400 and a mystery prize. No doubt a welcome boost to the bank balance, as Councillor Hudson is currently unemployed after recently stepping down from his long-term role with Victoria Police. Now to a problem facing many councils across the state which run local pools. Lifeguards in Campaspe Shire have reported 21 incidents of harassment and abuse over the past year, with 6 already recorded this year. The council is warning people to behave at the pool or risk losing access altogether. The council's Director of Communities, Joe Bradshaw, joins me now to tell us more about the impact this issue is having. Joe, thank you for your time. Can you just tell us a bit about what's been happening at the pools that's given rise to these concerns that you've expressed?
Sure, thanks, Chris. So we've seen an escalation this summer in abusive behaviour verbal abusive behaviour towards our lifeguards. And I suppose we have experienced this previously, but there is an escalation this summer, and in relation to the age group perpetrators, I suppose, that's where we've seen the escalation.
Yeah, so the story that went in the local paper talked about 21 incidents in the last year, but already six this year. So obviously the concern's rising that this is an increasing thing. And you mentioned young people, not just the perpetrators, but of course, a lot of your staff in these situations are young themselves, aren't they?
That's correct. The nature of lifeguards is that, and we've seen a spike in the outdoor pools. So we have one indoor facility that's open all year round, and we have seven outdoor, which are open, as I say, through the summer months. So it's a younger cohort of staff because of the nature of the season. You know, they're on university holidays, high school holidays, all of those sorts of things. So they are a younger cohort of staff, often, 18, 17, 16 in some cases.
Yeah, and in my experience, Joe, it's been a challenge in the past to recruit enough young people to take on these roles. What does this sort of environment that's being described here have in terms of an impact on trying to attract people in future, do you think? You must be concerned about that.
Yes, and that's why we've stepped up the support to those staff through these episodes so that we do attract them. And again, because of the nature of the staff, they do apply summer after summer after summer for a job. So we certainly don't want to lose any, especially as it becomes harder when university goes back and things like that to actually attract people. So we are supporting them with extra staffing from management when things have escalated, and offering additional breaks and things like that so that they can have time out of that
Yeah.
environment with the public.
What would you say to the community about this issue? What sort of a message would you like to send about respecting pool staff?
Yeah, please stop. Please stop the behaviour that is escalating for these staff. They're just doing their job. It's often quite challenging anyway because it's hot, and
Yeah.
they can't get in the pool because their responsibility is to make sure that everyone's safe. And the spike this year has also been, unfortunately, with parents abusing lifeguards. So and it's around making sure you're watching your child and making sure you're responsible for your child in the water, so that lifeguards don't need to approach you and ask you to please do so. So that's where some of the escalations come from this year.
It really is unacceptable, isn't it? And you've warned about potential pool closures if this continues. What would it take, do you think, to get to that point?
Look, if we have repeated behaviours, we would certainly look at banning people from attending the pools, which again is such a disappointment. We live in the top part of the state, so it gets pretty hot up here. So to think that we would have to ban people or potentially close pools to keep staff safe is really unfortunate. Our pools are also free admittance, so that also makes it challenging to keep track of people, who are coming and going, so to speak, in terms of their identity. So we're relying on the community to do the right thing, and potentially other community members that are sitting there by the pool as well to ask people to stop when they are abusive.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to say. Other people could step up and support here, couldn't they, when they see this happening?
Absolutely.
And you mentioned the hot weather. I've been watching the weather up in the Golden Valley in particular recently, a string of 40-degree days. It's been a pretty hot summer. You don't want to be removing people's access to pools at a time like this, do you? Yeah.
Exactly.
Joe, thank you for your time. Great to talk to you.
No problem. Thanks, Chris. Take care.
And that's this week's Connect News. For more of the latest on what's happening around the sector, listen to the Local Government News Roundup, brought to you by the VLGA and available wherever you listen to podcasts. Well, late last year, I was at an event where my next guest was speaking about a range of things to do with information privacy, but he touched on the issue of the increasing use of generative AI. And it made me think about this issue in relation to the way councillors receive and use information. And it's worth a discussion with some do's and don'ts and some risks. So we have with us Sean Morrison, the Victorian Information Commissioner. Sean, welcome to VLGA Connect.
Thanks, Chris, and happy to be here talking about an important topic.
Indeed, good to see you. So at that event, you raised that issue of people needing to be aware that as generative AI tools get used more and more, and we're thinking about things like ChatGPT and perhaps AI note takers in meetings, etc., that there are some real risks and issues that councillors and council officers should be taking into account.
Yes, so my office oversees the Privacy and Data Protection Act, which applies to councillors. And I think when we're talking about generative AI, we need to break down the two basic systems or approaches, and that is publicly available generative AI tools and then your enterprise in-house tools. And there's different risks for each tool, and then there's some common overlaps of the risks. So if we start with publicly available generative AI tools, and we're thinking of ChatGPT or Google Gemini, some of the risks there are when you're collecting personal information and then you're disclosing it to these publicly available tools, you could be in breach of the information privacy principles, such as you're disclosing all of that personal information to an environment where you have no control over. So there's IPv4, which talks about the obligation to protect personal information from unauthorized access, misuse, or modification. And really what we're seeing here is it's going into another company's database and system. You have no control over it. You can't erase it, and it could be used for another purpose. This purpose may not be a permitted secondary purpose, and there's also, you have issues around information flows when personal information is travelling outside Victoria.
So, Sean, can we perhaps put this in the context of a live example? So perhaps a councillor's got a set of documents that they've been provided to consider as part of a decision-making process, and they think, I might just get ChatGPT to summarise and pull out some key points of this for me. That's something you could see happening, but what you're saying is by doing that, you're effectively putting that document into the public domain.
Yes, it would depend on the approach of the publicly available tool, but effectively you've collected information for one purpose and now you're disclosing it for another. So you have the issue with being open and transparent and accountable and what your privacy policy says. The second thing is you're losing control of it. Who knows how that information could be used or repurposed? And then the other thing is you can't actually meet your retention and disposal authority or records control environment and protocols by doing that. So, and then there also is, I think we're taking the person out of this. There is the potential harm to the individual. It could be quite sensitive information or information in a certain context which shouldn't be in the public domain. So I think that's what councils need to think about is, how did I come into possession of this information? What did we tell the individual when we collected it? What was the purpose? But you can't get around that control element really with publicly available tools. And I will just say one thing about in-house tools. While some of those risks are mitigated, just because it's an in-house custom-built or enterprise tool, and we're thinking about Microsoft Copilot, for example, doesn't mean the whole organisation should see that personal information as well. So I wouldn't like individuals working in a council office or council offices to think that just because it's an in-house tool, everyone in the organisation should see that personal information. So it's about having secure portals of information that are in access controls.
Sean, are you aware of any examples where something like this has occurred and information's been exposed perhaps inappropriately and caused some detriment?
Look, we have a secrecy provision under our legislation, so I can't be too specific, but we are seeing privacy complaints potentially about the misuse of personal information with generative AI systems. And we have in the public domain an investigation into a government organisation that did misuse a generative AI system with personal information. So that's out there for the public to see, and I'm happy to provide the link, and it'll go into the details and the pitfalls and dangers.
Sure. And I notice on your website that even the Office of the Victorian Information Commissioner has a policy about the use of generative AI note takers in meetings, for example. You won't participate in a meeting where those note takers are being used if there's a important level of information that's being discussed or disclosed in those meetings.
In summary, we will take part, but it will be a limited participation if certain topics are being discussed where the level of information should not be in the public domain. We have a lot of confidential conversations with individuals and organisations, from application of the law, investigations, legislation, etc. So I think this comes back to the other risk, Chris, which is not just about personal information, but just that also councillors and council officers should be aware, just because it's not personal information, if it's critical or sensitive information that's not known in the public, they shouldn't be entering it into these public systems. And the Victorian government's put out an administrative guideline on that about entering critical information into these systems. So it's not just personal information, it's also business information that is confidential or involves other business undertakings.
Yeah. Sean, it seems to me not a week goes by that I don't see something about an advance in the way these AI tools are being used, or their capabilities, or new tools that are coming. It must be very difficult to keep up, and I guess from a councillor or a council officer point of view, very hard to be ahead of the curve on this one. How do you find keeping up with the risks here, given the technology's just advancing so quickly?
Look, it's difficult to keep up with the technology and all the hooks and limitations and the changes that are coming around, and some of the technology evolves to potentially stay ahead of the law. But I think people are getting confused with the complexity of the technology and potentially implementation, and first principles around privacy, hygiene, and security and data hygiene. And that comes back to that if you have a generative AI policy within your council, it doesn't have to be systems specific. It can be principles based. So I'd say that trying to play whack-a-mole with every system that comes about is the wrong way to go about it, because you'll get gaps. It really is coming back to the first principles of having good hygiene around those things and getting ahead with a policy.
That makes perfect sense when you put it like that. Now, speaking of policy, have you seen any good examples of AI policies in the local government sphere as of yet?
Look, we don't do a sweep of them, but there is some room for improvement. But we've also had agencies engage with us on that point, which is heartening. So look, it's a developing area of policy as well. So the answer is limited to no.
Okay. So perhaps I can rephrase. What would you like to see in policies to deal with this issue at the local government level?
I think we'd like to see what generative AI tools council has approved to start with, rather than trying to deal with the whole spectrum. They've assessed a tool for its security risks, its limitations, data flows. They've done a privacy impact assessment and a security risk assessment on that. So there is a potentially approved tool or range of tools. And then it's not just that the tool is permitted, but there's certain use cases and an authorizing framework. So it may be that only certain users with specific training are authorized to use that tool, or certain use cases, and then a roles and responsibilities chart in there about who has the final say, like a hierarchy of decision making, who is responsible for security, privacy, etc., document retention. And then the other things are about how to report a security or privacy incident as well. And then it's about also being open and accountable with the people you're dealing with. Potentially that information may be used in that system.
Does your office have the capacity, and do you welcome inquiries about how to make those policies fit for purpose?
Look, we have limited capacity, but I think we should start with the inquiries. We've got some guidance material and resource coming out further on these points, but we always welcome inquiries.
Terrific. And there's a great resource there with your website at ovic.vic.gov.au if people would like to start down the journey of understanding how this issue might impact them. Sean, it's fascinating, and it's probably a topic we should come back to in 6 or 12 months as it keeps changing, to see whether there's any updates that we should be providing.
Definitely happy to come back, because it is an emerging area. And I think the best principle to think about is that this is just another use case for personal information, and also another avenue potentially for exposure from a data security point. And these guidelines aren't here to stifle innovation. They're actually there to assist you in doing it safely.
Thanks so much for your time. Fascinating topic, and hope to talk again.
Thanks, Chris. See you next
That's Sean
time.
Morrison, the Victorian Information Commissioner. Always good to have Tony Raunic with us from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, back this week with his take on ministerial guidelines that are now in force affecting every council in Victoria and the way they deal with unpaid rates. Tony, welcome back.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be back. And this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because it crept up on us on Christmas Eve.
I was going to ask you whether
year.
we knew did we know this was coming?
Well, I didn't. And indeed, this is the first set of guidelines released by the minister, as I understand it, under Section 181, capital A, capital A,
Right.
of the Local Government Act 1989. So yes, that old act still does have some impact on the sector, particularly in relation to rates.
Yeah, okay. And this is largely responding to an ombudsman report from a few years ago about how councils deal with rates arrears and residents or ratepayers suffering hardship. And it's brought in some pretty specific requirements and obligations on councils with a sting in the tail too if there's no compliance.
Absolutely. So their councils are actually directed by these guidelines to review and update their policies against the principles set out in the guidelines. And I should say, Chris, that there's a really excellent article on the Maddox website by Chris Cantor and his colleagues, and we've had the benefit of reading that, and it's a really helpful summary. But the guidelines introduce these mandatory principles that councils must follow. So councils must offer modern and flexible payment options that are tailored to their community's needs and have to provide simple and multiple methods of communication about rates and charges. And they have to treat the community equitably, compassionately, proportionately, including in relation to any hardship applications. So in fact, councils are told in the guidelines that they're strongly discouraged from applying interest in circumstances of hardship. So when someone's indicated they're in a hardship situation, the council shouldn't be, or according to the guidelines, is discouraged from applying interest. And payment plans, according to the guidelines, payment plans should be available to everyone, whether they're experiencing hardship or not.
So if you want to pay your rates on a monthly basis or a fortnightly basis, that's the way I read it.
Yes.
What these guidelines are saying, the council should make it possible for you to do so.
That's how I'm reading it too, Chris. And so councils that say, no, this is the only way you can do it, you can either pay it in these quarterly installments or pay it in one hit, will need to become much more flexible. And I think that we need to do something because there is a crisis in relation to rate arrears seemingly across the sector. And according to a recent article in the by Rachel Dexter in The Age, I believe, Chris, what we've seen in recent years is a significant increase in rate arrears, such that in the 2024-2025 financial year, we reached this annual peak of rate arrears being 10.44% of the rates collected across the sector. And that's a 32% jump on the year before. And the early figures in for 2025, 2026 say it's getting worse. An average of 11.6% of households across the sector are currently in arrears.
That's a pretty scary number, isn't it? And just anecdotally, Tony, I know from doing the local government news roundup, I can't recall ever seeing so many stories about councils, not just in Victoria, but in other states as well, looking to sell off properties because of unpaid rates. Do the guidelines talk about that sort of action?
Well, they tell council that they've got to come up with these innovative and flexible arrangements. And so I guess councils are going to have to find ways to free up cash to be able to basically make sure that they continue to be liquid during the
Yeah.
period they're waiting for these
Yeah.
rates to be paid. And
Seems to me also, Tony, some of the references here could be a bit subjective. So what does it mean to say treat with compassion and equity? Does it unpack that at all?
yeah, I think that those words have a different meaning for many of us, and I think the way it's unpacked is saying that there's a need to offer these multiple options in terms of payment of rates, and there's also a need to offer multiple forms of communication. So you can't, it seems that I wonder whether councils might be prevented from simply saying, there's one way to pay rates. You've got to pay it through BPay, and that's the only way. That seems to me to be would offend these guidelines. You need multiple options for people, and particular councils, Chris, are facing even bigger crises on this. I saw the figures for Yarra Ranges and Whittlesea councils, and their rate of arrears is currently, sorry for the double there, but their arrears is at 20% currently. Port Phillip, so we're not just talking about outer growth areas. Port Phillip's at 19%, Brimbank at 18%, and Frankston at 17%. And Chris, it seems that the COVID experience may perhaps explain some of these rate arrears, because during the COVID period, we saw a lot of pauses on enforcement. The taxation department weren't chasing taxes as much. Councils put a pause on chasing, enforcing rate arrears arrangements, and it seems that some ratepayers might have assumed that was an ongoing forgiveness or ongoing rate relief, when in fact it was just a deferral. One of the perhaps examples worth raising is that these innovative flexible arrangements can actually impact on a reduction in rate arrears, and the City of Greater Dandenong, Chris, has had some real success here. I don't know if you saw the Mayor, Sophie Tan, come out.
Yeah, I did. Just explain what they've done there, because it sounded very sensible.
Yeah, well, at Greater Dandenong, they're allowing their ratepayers to pay rates in what they call bite-sized installments, so that kind of weekly, fortnightly installment payments. And Sophie Tan says this has become a really popular option at Greater Dandenong. And it makes sense, I guess. People make decisions about, do I pay my mortgage in monthly or fortnightly installments? Often people make savings by, putting a little bit away each week in a bite-sized amount. But Dandenong's experience has been that their arrears rate has improved over time with the introduction of these flexible, innovative arrangements. So maybe some of the rate departments out there might be having a look at what Greater Dandenong are doing and applying some of those measures.
A really good case study. I guess what we'd like to see is more consistency, and that's what these guidelines are aiming to achieve in one sense. There's also, as I said at the outset, a sting in the tail here. If councils are found to be non-compliant, what could happen?
Yes, well. In fact, there is that ability for the minister and the department to step in and where they feel the council isn't giving appropriate guidance or giving appropriate consideration here, and an aggrieved person, a ratepayer who believes the council isn't doesn't have an appropriate policy, can seek a judicial review of a council policy that's not compliant with these guidelines, and that's a ministerial direction now under Part 7.
Judicial review, what does that mean? Does that mean VCAT? Does it mean something else?
I guess it probably would be VCAT, Chris.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
not certain myself, but I
Yeah.
imagine VCAT or the Magistrates Court would be the approach here.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Jess, it does seem that that report some years back by led by Deborah Glass, the then
Former ombudsman.
ombudsman, looking at that just a lack of flexibility at some councils, a lack of consideration for hardship that community members were experiencing, putting charging interest on arrears where someone had indicated they were going through a temporary period of financial hardship, has been was heavily criticised by the ombudsman, and now we've seen the Parliament come out and issue these guidelines, which are mandatory for councils now.
All right, they're in place, as we say. A bit of a Christmas surprise, as you said, Tony. So your take, bottom line here, good thing, bad thing, neutral for the sector? What do you reckon?
Oh, look, I think it's one of those things. It's a sector. It makes things more difficult for the sector in dealing with rates, but I think it's shouldn't be unexpected, and it's appropriate that these sectors responding to the cost of living and the hardship being experienced in the community. And ultimately, if the sector doesn't bring in flexible arrangements and innovative practices here, then the sector will suffer because, yes, we know that rate arrears attached to the land, and councils can say, well, ultimately when the land is sold, we'll be able to collect the rate arrears out of the sale proceeds. But knowing that you're going to get some money eventually doesn't help you fix the roads in the meantime. And you can't sort of, it's not an asset you're borrowing on. So I think that it makes sense for councils to have another look at their approaches to hardship, have another look at just are they offering a range of payment options to all their ratepayers.
Well, thank you, Tony. As you mentioned, that guide by Maddix, if people are looking for that, head to maddix.com.au/insights and you'll find it on that page. Some good work there summarising to save the likes of you and me from having to navigate it ourselves. And thanks for your take, Tony. As always, good to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here.
Tony Raunic from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers, our sponsors here on VLGA Connect. And that brings us to the end of a bumper edition of VLGA Connect. I hope you found something of interest in today's program. We'll have more for you next week. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button on YouTube or on your podcast player to make sure you don't miss future episodes. With Fast Track fast approaching on the 27th of February, we'll have a special episode on that coming for you very soon as well. Lots ahead on VLGA Connect. But for now, that's all, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.